Today's lesson is Fancy a game of checkers or chess? Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
Hello, I'm Kiki.
And today we're going to talk about board games. These are games that you play on a board, basically, and there are many varieties of them. We've got Risk, we've got Clue, and, of course, we've got the more traditional ones, which we're going to talk about today, checkers or chess. Have you played these games before, and do you like to play them, Kiki?
I have played chess. I was in the chess club, but I wasn't very good at it. It was really interesting because I like watching people play chess because you try to see how many steps ahead they're thinking. But for me, I'm only looking at what's right in front of me, so I'm not very good at chess.
I'm not either. It does require a lot of concentration and a lot of strategy, but a simpler game to play would be checkers, and we're going to talk about these two games in today's program, and this is suitable for the time of year because it is in January right now. You might be spending time indoors. And, of course, you could download apps and play these games on your phone, but, of course, it's more fun to play with an actual person on an actual board, and we suggest you try that. But we're going to talk about checkers or chess right now, so let's listen to the first part.
Fancy a game of checkers or chess? Checkers and chess are two popular board games that have been around for centuries. While they share many similarities, most notably in their checkered boards and how their game pieces are set up, they're actually quite different in terms of how they're played. Let's have a look at each to see why some people might prefer one over the other.
大家好，第一部分来介绍副词 notably， 它的意思是格外的或是尤其，也可以是值得注意的或是显然的意思。例如The guests were notably impressed by the food offered at the party. 派对上所提供的食物让宾客们格外的印象深刻。又或者说 The band's new album sold very well, most notably in the United States and Japan. 该乐团发行的新专辑销售得非常的好，尤其是在美国跟日本。再来，我们看到片语 in terms of 名词或是 in terms of 动词 ing， 它的意思是就点点点而言，或是从点点点方面来看。例如 In terms of reactions from the audience, our performance was highly successful. 从观众的反应来看，我们的表演非常成功。又或者说 In terms of selling situation, this product is less attractive to most customers. 从销售情况来看，该产品对大部分顾客来说吸引力较小。
Let's start talking about the first part of our article today about checkers and chess. Checkers and chess are two popular board games that have been around for centuries. So these are games that we play on a board, and they've been played by many generations. They've been around for hundreds of years. While they share many similarities, most notably in their checkered boards and how their game pieces are set up, they're actually quite different in terms of how they're played. So they are very similar in a lot of ways. The game of chess and checkers, they both are played on checkered boards. So checkered boards are the boards that they're played on, and they have lots of different squares, and every square is a different color that goes from black, white, black, white, black, white. And sometimes it might be different colors, white, green. Or, Roger, have you seen any other colored checkerboards?
Well, the checkerboard we had when I was a kid was red and black. And it was made out of cardboard, and you could fold it up and put it away. Of course, we played a lot of checkers when I was a kid. But again, checkers and chess are two popular board games, and they've been around for a long, long time. And they share lots of similarities. They're very similar. They're kind of alike each other in a lot of ways, most notably in their checkered boards. Okay, so notably here just means that is something that stands out. It's something worth noting. It's something worth paying attention to. And yes, indeed, most notably or most noticeable would be the fact that they use these checkered boards and also how the game pieces are set up. So, of course, when you want to prepare a game, you need to set up the pieces first.
Right. And they're actually quite different, though. Even though you have to set up the game pieces and they're both played on these checkerboards, they have a lot of differences as well. So they're actually quite different in terms of how they're played. So here we have the phrase in terms of, and that means basically in connection to something. So in this case, it is in connection to the way the game is played, or the rules are different. So even though they're similar in some ways, they are still different in terms of or in the way they are played.
Right. You could substitute the word considering, and in terms of again means when you think about it, when you take something into consideration. For example, I could say, in terms of experience, Lisa has the most and therefore she's most qualified for the job. So yes, in terms of how they're played, they are quite different, and they have different kinds of pieces, and the pieces move in different directions. And we're finishing off the first paragraph here by saying, let's have a look at each to see why some people might prefer one over the other. So let's look at each of these different games and see why some people would rather play checkers or they would rather play chess. So let's move on now to the next paragraph. It's quite long, so listen carefully.
Checkers is typically played on a board with 64 alternating light and dark squares, and each player starts with 12 identical game pieces. To win the game, you must capture all of your opponent's pieces before your opponent captures yours. Initially, pieces can only be moved forward diagonally into unoccupied squares, but if an opponent's piece is in an adjacent square, it can be captured by jumping your piece over it. Meanwhile, if a piece makes it to the last row of the opponent's side of the board, it becomes a king. Unlike regular pieces, a king can move both forward and backward while seeking to capture the opponent's pieces.
第二部分看到单字 opponent， 它是名词，指的是比赛中的对手、竞争者或是反对者。例如 The two opponents shook hands after the tennis match. 在网球比赛后，两位对手相互握手。或是 The new legislation drew criticism from its opponents. 该新法案引起了反对者的批评。接下来介绍副词 initially， 指的是最初或是起初。可以说 Patricia initially planned on going to Japan for her vacation, but she decided to go to Thailand instead. Patricia 起初打算假期时去日本旅游，但她却决定去泰国。或者说 The room was initially going to be my office, but instead we used it for storage. 起初这间房间是我的办公室，但是我们却用它来存放物品。接着是 diagonally 这个单字，它是副词，表示斜向的或是对角的。例如 We walked diagonally across the wide field. 我们斜对角的穿越广阔的田野。或者 When making this dish, you have to slice the potato diagonally. 在做这道菜时，你需要对角切马铃薯。再来是 unoccupied， 这个形容词意思是未被占领的或是控制的。例如 After being struck by the enemy, this region is the only territory left unoccupied. 在被敌人袭击后，这个地区是唯一未被占领的领土。或是 Many of the apartments in these newly built buildings are unoccupied. 这座新建大楼中的许多公寓都还没有人居住。下一个是单字 adjacent， 它是形容词，表示毗连的或是邻近的。举例来说 My parents moved into a house adjacent to mine after they grew old. 我的父母年老时搬到邻近我家的房子。
Let's talk about checkers first. Checkers is typically played on a board with 64 alternating light and dark squares, and each player starts with 12 identical game pieces. So the game of checkers is played on a board, and it has 64 alternating light and dark squares. So this board is made up of light and dark squares, and they are alternating. So the word alternating means when two or more things happen in turn repeatedly. So sometimes we can think of alternating lights. So when a light turns yellow and red, they are alternating. So we see that at a cross section. Or sometimes you can see that you have players in a sports game, they alternate. So they take turns playing. Okay, so it is when two or more things, they keep happening repeatedly and they take turns. So in this case, the board, it changes from light, dark, light, dark, light, dark squares. And each player, they will have 12 pieces, 12 identical pieces to start off.
Right. Again, we're talking about the game of checkers. I should mention that this is what we call it in the United States. In England, I believe they call it drafts. So be aware of that. But again, each player gets 12 identical game pieces. They're usually flat little discs. And they're pretty easy to set up. And to win the game, you must capture all of your opponent's pieces before your opponent captures yours. So, of course, the person you're playing against is your opponent. If the New York Yankees were playing against the Boston Red Sox, then the Red Sox would be their opponents, the player or players that you're playing against in a particular game. In this particular case, it does refer to your competition, the person you're playing against. And yes, indeed, you each have a set of 12 pieces, and you need to capture all of your opponent's pieces to win the game.
So all 12 game pieces are identical. So everybody has the same, except Roger might have a black set and I might have a red set. And we both have 12 identical game pieces. So they all look like same little circle pieces. So the word identical means to be similar in every detail or to be exactly the same. So another time that we might hear the word identical might be when we hear someone describing identical twins. They were born on the same day, the same time, maybe different minute, but they were born identical twins. They look exactly the same.
Right, okay, that's an identical twin, the ones that came from the same egg, whereas if they're different eggs and they don't look exactly the same, then they are fraternal twins. There is a difference there. But again, you get 12 identical game pieces. They are pieces that look exactly the same. And again, to win the game, you need to capture all of your opponent's pieces before they get all of yours. Now, initially, or at the beginning, pieces can only be moved forward diagonally into unoccupied squares. But if an opponent's piece is in an adjacent square, it can be captured by jumping your piece over it. So initially, this is how you begin the game at the beginning. Initially, you can move your pieces forward only, and they have to move diagonally. They cannot go forward or sideways.
So the word diagonally means a straight line that is at an angle, or it's a slanted line. So at the beginning of the checkers game, you can move your pieces forward diagonally. They can only move at an angle on a slanted line, and you can move it into an unoccupied square. So unoccupied means something that is not being used or it is empty. So you can move your piece into an empty square.
Right. This building has been unoccupied for many years. They ought to tear it down, for example. And, of course, this happens when you're moving your pieces. You move them diagonally forward, not backwards or sideways, at a 45-degree angle. But if an opponent's piece is in an adjacent square, it can be captured by jumping your piece over it. So, yes, indeed, if there's a piece in the adjacent square or the square right next to yours, then you can jump your piece over it, but there needs to be a space on the other side.
So, for example, the word adjacent could be used, where is the CEO's office? The CEO's office is adjacent to the big conference room.
Right. Or, of course, if you're flying with somebody on the plane, you hope you can get adjacent seats or seats that are next to each other so you can chat and enjoy the flight together. Sometimes it doesn't happen that way. But again, the piece is in an adjacent square and it can be captured if you jump over that piece. Then you remove that piece from the board and you're ahead. And meanwhile, if a piece makes it to the last row of the opponent's side of the board, it becomes a king. And yes, indeed, I do remember playing that game. If you can move your piece all the way to the other side of the board in the final row that's closest to your opponent, then you can become a king, and it has extra power that way.
So, unlike regular pieces, a king can move both forward and backward while seeking to capture the opponent's pieces. So, once you get one of your pieces, your normal discs, to the last row, it becomes a king, and you just put another disc on it, and this king becomes more powerful. It can move forward and backwards. So, you have more movement on the checkered board, and you can capture pieces more easily.
And remember, the ultimate goal of this game is to capture all of your opponent's pieces.
And that's all for part 2 of our article today. Let's listen to part 3.
Generally speaking, checkers isn't considered a highly strategic game. Thus, it might appeal more to people who like games that don't require intense concentration.
第3部分最后来看到 strategic， 它是形容词，指的是策略的或是战略性的。例如 Arranging resources properly is an important part of any company's strategic planning. 适当管理资源是公司策略规划中重要的一个环节。再看一个例子 Both countries agreed to reduce their supplies of strategic weapons. 两国同意削减战略性武器的供应量。
Okay, let's talk about part 3 now. It says, generally speaking. In other words, we're not talking specifically about anything. We're just talking in general. Checkers isn't considered a highly strategic game. Indeed, checkers is a game usually played by children because it is rather simple and it's hard to have a strategy with it. It's all kind of based on luck. And, of course, you can win pretty easily if you know what you're doing. But, again, there's not a lot of strategy involved. So if we talk about something being strategic, that means you have to plan ahead. You have to have a strategy. You have to have a plan. Of course, they say that go or 围棋 in Chinese is very strategic. You need to be thinking way ahead in order to capture your opponent's pieces.
Thus, it might appeal more to people who like games that don't require intense concentration. So we talked about checkers being a game that is suitable for younger people, for kids. It's easier to play. You don't need a lot of strategy. So for people that don't like games that require intense concentration. So intense concentration basically just means to have a lot of focus and you're really fixed on this particular task. So let's break it down. The word intense means to have an extreme feeling or to have a very strong feeling of something. Or sometimes it could be even to describe strength. So there's an intense pain in my abdomen, so it's hurting a lot. And then you have the word concentration. So concentration is to focus all of your attention or all of your energy on a specific topic or to focus on something. So when you have intense concentration, you're really, really focused on this game. So we know that a lot of times chess players have intense concentration. So if you have the opportunity to watch a chess game, you'll see that usually the audience is very quiet because the chess players need a lot of intense concentration, so we have to be quiet.
Yep, again, you don't need to have a lot of intense concentration when you play checkers. It is kind of mindless game. Again, it's a game played by children mostly, but adults can play this game as well. I should say that we often played checkers in university because you could create various drinking games with checkers. If you lost the game, for example, you would have to drink a shot of tequila or something like that. We don't recommend you do that, though, because it can be pretty bad for your health. But in any case, checkers is not really an intense game. It doesn't require a lot of concentration. And remember, the verb here is to concentrate. So, for example, if you're taking an exam, you need to concentrate or you need to have a lot of concentration. So there you go. We've introduced checkers to all of you today. And in our next program, we're going to talk about chess, which requires more intense concentration. We look forward to talking to you about that then, but right now we're going to listen to Hanny, our beloved Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第一部分提到西洋跳棋和西洋棋尽管有许多相似之处，但实际上其玩法却有很大的不同。那文中是用 in terms of how they're played 去表达说就其玩法而言的语义。 in terms of 就是表达就什么而言，从什么方面来看。那片语里面这个 terms 固定用复数形，我们这边是要补充两个跟 terms有关的片语。第一个是 come to terms with， 是表达说逐渐接受或是妥协的意思。那么 terms 固定用复数形，当它的受词是事物， come to terms with something 是表达说对什么释怀啊、妥协或是勉强接受某事物，那常常是指令人难过、痛苦不悦的事实。那么这个受词如果是人的话， come to terms with somebody 则是表达跟某人达成协议、妥协。好，我们看个例句哦。 It took her several years to come to terms with the loss of her pet。 她花了好几年的时间才慢慢接受她宠物过世这件事。好，那第二个补充的片语是on one's terms 或是 on one's own terms， 是表达用自己的方式，根据自己的愿望。 terms 也是固定用复数形，那在这边它其实指条件，像协议啊、合约的条件。那我们可以用 on one's terms 或是 on one's own terms 去表达说根据自己的条件，依照自己的愿望。像如果说 live life on your own terms 就是表达照你自己的方式生活。好，课文下一句提到说 Let's have a look at each to see why some people might prefer one over the other。 这边我们是要整理一下 prefer 的用法。动词 prefer 它表示更喜欢、偏好，后面可以接不定词、接名词或是接动名词，像Tina prefers to shop online 或者是 Tina prefers shopping online。 Tina 偏好线上购物。好，那现在如果我们要去比较两者的偏好，表达说比较喜欢什么而非什么，更喜欢什么胜过什么，这边有几个常见的句型可以表达出类似的语义哦。像第一个我们可以用 prefer A to B 或者是 prefer A over B。 那这个句型里面的 A、B 必须用名词或动名词表达。例如 She prefers swimming to jogging。 她喜欢游泳胜过慢跑。那么第二个可以用到的句型是 prefer to 动词 rather than 动词。例如 I prefer to read books rather than watch TV。 我比较喜欢看书而不是看电视。那第三个我们可以用到 prefer to 动词 instead of 动词 ing。 举例来说 Dave prefers to cook at home instead of eating out。 Dave 比较喜欢在家开火而不是外食。好，那以上就是今天重点整理，我们回顾今天单字吧。
Alternating。The sweater had a pattern of alternating red and brown stripes. Identical. Mona's copy of the famous painting looks almost identical to it. Opponent. Toby studied video clips of his opponent before their tennis match. Initially. Although she wasn't interested in the offer initially, Anne eventually agreed to take the job. Strategic. We will need to develop a strategic plan to increase the company's profits. Intense.The storm is expected to bring intense winds and heavy rain. Concentration. Sheila showed complete concentration as she solved the difficult math problem.
Well, everyone, today's article has come to an end, and I sure hope you enjoyed reading along with us. I am Kiki.
I am Roger.
See you next time.